Imagine this. You're a government official in ancient China, and you need to send a single report to the emperor, not stacks of paperwork. One report, so you carve your message into strips of bamboo, one character at a time, tie the strips together into a bundle, and prepare to have it delivered. Except this one report now weighs so much, it takes multiple people to carry it. There are actual historical accounts describing an emperor reviewing a literal cartload of bamboo documents in a single day, just to get through his routine correspondence. You'd think something as important as writing, something that carries laws, history, poetry, the entire memory of a civilization, would have started on something worthy of it, something precious. Instead, for a huge stretch of early Chinese history, writing lived on heavy, bulky, awkward strips of wood. And if you wanted something lighter, your only real alternative was silk. Silk worked beautifully as a writing surface. Smooth, light, easy to roll up and carry. There was just one enormous problem. Silk was one of the most expensive materials in the ancient world. Writing on it wasn't really an option for most people. It was reserved almost entirely for the wealthy and for the most important official documents. So here's where this story actually starts to get interesting. If you wanted to write something down in ancient China, and you weren't wealthy enough for silk, and you weren't willing to load an ox cart with bamboo, your options were genuinely limited. And that gap between something too heavy and something too expensive is exactly the problem that led to one of the most quietly world-changing inventions in human history. Here's the twist nobody expects. The solution to this problem wasn't a new precious material at all. It came from the exact opposite direction. It came from garbage. Long before anyone perfected papermaking, there's evidence that rough, crude versions of paper-like material were already floating around China, made from hemp fiber, used more for wrapping and padding than for actual writing. Nobody was thinking of this stuff as a writing surface yet. It was just useful scrap material made by beating plant fiber down into a rough mat. The real transformation is usually credited to a court official named Cai Lun, working during the Han dynasty around the year 105. And here's the detail that makes this story genuinely remarkable. Cai Lun didn't invent papermaking out of nowhere. He refined it, using materials that on their own sound almost absurd as the foundation of one of history's most important inventions. Mulberry bark, hemp waste, old rags, worn out and no longer usable as clothing, even discarded fishing nets, torn beyond repair and thrown away. Think about what that actually means. The material that would go on to carry laws, literature, philosophy, and eventually the spread of ideas across the entire world started as things people were actively throwing away. Nobody set out looking for something precious enough to write on. Someone looked at a pile of trash and asked a completely different question. What if you broke this down completely and rebuilt it into something new? The actual process was surprisingly elegant once refined. Take these waste materials, soak them, beat them down into a loose, wet pulp of individual fibers, completely destroying whatever the material used to be. Then spread that pulp thin and even across a fine mesh screen, letting the water drain away while the tangled fibers bond together as they dry. What's left, once fully dried and pressed flat, is a thin, light, surprisingly strong sheet. Paper, this wasn't a one-time lucky discovery. Getting the fiber consistency right, getting the pulp thin enough to dry properly without falling apart, getting a surface smooth enough to actually write on legibly, all of that took real refinement, tested and adjusted repeatedly until it reliably worked. And once it did work reliably, the impact was almost immediate. Paper was dramatically lighter than bamboo and dramatically cheaper than silk. For the first time, something that could hold writing didn't require either enormous bulk or enormous wealth. Paper-making techniques and the raw materials to make it were, relative to silk, everywhere. Suddenly, writing wasn't locked behind weight or cost anymore. But this technique, as remarkable as it was, stayed a closely guarded advantage inside China for a surprisingly long time. What happened next is its own story of secrecy, war, and a discovery that eventually escaped, one way or another, into the rest of the world. Here's a fact that sounds almost too dramatic to be true, but isn't. For hundreds of years after Cai Lun refined papermaking, the actual technique for making it was closely protected, largely staying within China. And the way it finally spread beyond China's borders wasn't through trade, or diplomacy, or curious scholars sharing ideas. It spread because of a battle. In the year 751, forces from the Tang dynasty clashed with an Abbasid army near the Talas River, in a region spanning parts of modern-day Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. The battle itself is a footnote in most history books, but according to widely repeated historical accounts, among the prisoners taken afterward were skilled papermakers, and with them quite possibly went the secret of how paper was actually made. From there, papermaking knowledge is believed to have spread through the Islamic world, reaching cities like Samarkand and Baghdad, where papermaking flourished and eventually became a thriving industry in its own right. From there, over the following centuries, the technique continued moving further west, eventually reaching Europe, where it would go on to fundamentally reshape how information spread across the entire continent. Sit with that for a second. One of the most quietly transformative technologies in human history, the ability to write things down cheaply and pass them on, may have escaped its country of origin not through peaceful exchange, but as a byproduct of a single military conflict most people have never heard of. And once paper reached a wider world, its impact compounded in ways nobody in that original Han Dynasty workshop could have possibly predicted. Centuries later, when the printing press emerged in Europe, it needed exactly this kind of material, cheap, light, and available at scale, to make mass-produced books and widespread literacy genuinely possible. Without paper already established as an affordable writing surface, the entire printing revolution would have had nothing practical to print on. A pile of old rags and fishing nets, pulped down by a Han Dynasty official trying to solve a practical writing problem, ended up quietly setting the stage for how information would spread across the entire world, centuries later. But let's be honest about what actually went into perfecting this. Turning trash into something reliably usable as paper wasn't glamorous work. And it wasn't easy. Early papermakers worked with wet, heavy pulp for hours at a time, hands submerged repeatedly in water to spread and drain each sheet evenly across a mesh screen. Getting the thickness consistent sheet after sheet took real physical skill built up through repetition, with no scientific measurement to guide them, only feel and experience. The raw materials themselves weren't pleasant to work with either. Rotting rags, torn fishing nets, and plant fiber had to be broken down, often through prolonged soaking and pounding, in conditions that were physically demanding and frankly unglamorous compared to the elegant finished sheets that eventually came out the other end. And once papermaking became valuable knowledge, it also became something worth protecting, sometimes at real human cost, as seen in accounts of skilled papermakers being taken as prisoners of war, their expertise treated as valuable spoils rather than as their own personal craft. Every early sheet of paper, smooth and unremarkable as it looks today, came from real, repetitive, physically demanding labor, refined slowly over generations by people whose names, much like the early metalworkers and distillers before them, mostly never made it into any history book. So why did ancient China end up writing on garbage? Because the alternative was worse. Bamboo was too heavy, silk was too expensive, and somewhere in that gap someone looked at discarded rags, worn-out fishing nets, and scrap plant fiber and saw not waste but raw material. That's genuinely different from the accidental discoveries running through metal, oil, and alcohol. Nobody stumbled onto paper by watching nature do it first. This one was deliberate, engineered, refined on purpose, sheet by sheet, until it actually worked. But the underlying curiosity is the same thread running through every one of these stories. Look at what's around you, even the stuff everyone else has thrown away, and ask what it could become instead. There is still more of that same curiosity worth chasing. Somewhere in ancient kitchens, oil wasn't originally meant for cooking at all. It was for lighting lamps and for ritual. How it ended up in your food instead of just your lamp is its own story. That one's coming whenever the moment feels right for it. If this is the kind of question you didn't know you needed answered, you know what to do.